Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going exploring the philosophy behind conservation biology. We got a lot of questions from you about what to conserve, but before we can even get to that, we need to unpack a more fundamental question. What exactly is biodiversity?
A great place to start.
I mean, you might think it's as simple as, counting up all the different species out there.
Right.
But it gets a lot more complicated than that, trust me.
You're absolutely right. Even the term biodiversity itself, it's relatively new.
Oh,
It wasn't even around until the 1980s.
Huh. So before the 80s, nobody was talking about biodiversity. That seems kind of strange considering how important it is to conservation today.
Yeah, it is a bit strange. The term actually first appeared at the National Forum on Biodiversity back in 1986.
Sorry.
It was a huge event. Over 14,000 people attended.
Wow.
Including, big names like E.O. Wilson and Jared Diamond.
Wow, 14,000 people. That's incredible.
Yeah. And it marked a turning point, really, in how we think about conservation.
So what was it about that specific forum that made it such a catalyst for this whole idea of biodiversity?
Well, for one thing, it brought together all these scientists, policymakers, and conservationists from all over the world. It created a platform for this new idea to really gain some traction. And even the way the term was coined, it kind of hinted at the philosophical issues that it would bring up, down the road.
Okay.
Walter Rosen, who's the one who shortened biological diversity to biodiversity, he said he specifically wanted to take out that logical part.
Interesting.
Almost like they knew from the start that this was about more than just pure science, right?
That's a really interesting point. So if biodiversity isn't just, counting species, what is it then?
Well, I guess the most basic definition is that it represents the variety of life.
Okay.
At all levels, genes, species, entire ecosystems.
Okay.
But like you said, it's not really that simple.
Yeah, because if we were trying to conserve every single variation, we'd be trying to save everything. It'd be like saying every book in the library is equally important and we can't get rid of any.
Right. Yeah.
Where would we even begin?
Exactly. And Sahotra Sarkar, he's a philosopher and conservation biologist, he makes this point.
Okay.
He argues that trying to conserve all variation would basically make all of biology conservation.
Right.
Which is just not practical.
It's just not possible.
Yeah.
So it's like we need a system for deciding which variations are more crucial to protect than others.
Yeah.
How do we prioritize in the face of so much diversity?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it gets really tricky. It raises all these questions, like should we prioritize so-called junk DNA? Are wild populations more important than captive ones? What about rare versus common habitats? These are the types of dilemmas that make defining and measuring biodiversity such a fascinating but challenging endeavor.
Well, there are a few different approaches out there to try to make sense of all this. One framework, it was developed by philosophers James McLaurin and Kim Sterelny. They take what they call a multidimensional view.
Multidimensional.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty complex.
Yeah.
What makes their view so, multidimensional?
Well, because they argue that, biodiversity is more than just the number of species you find in an ecosystem, right?
Okay.
It's about recognizing the variety of life across all these different scales, from genes to ecosystems and all the ways that those variations interact.
So it's not just about how many species there are, but also how those species differ from each other.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
McLaurin and Sterelny, they start with species richness as this kind of foundational element,
Right.
but they emphasize an evolutionary definition of species.
Okay.
Meaning seeing species as distinct lineages with their own unique evolutionary paths. That makes sense. It's kind of like how we intuitively categorize living things, right?
Yeah.
Birds with birds, fish with fish. We have field guides based on these categories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those field guides, they reflect a natural organization that's out there in the living world. But species richness, it's just one dimension, right?
Okay.
They also emphasize the importance of something called species evenness.
Species evenness. What does that mean?
So imagine, you have two forests, each with, say, 100 species, right?
Okay.
One forest has a few dominant species that have, huge populations, while the others are, barely hanging on.
Okay.
The second forest has a more balanced distribution where the population sizes are more equitable.
Okay.
Which one would you say feels more diverse?
I would say the second one, the one with the more balanced populations.
Exactly.
Even though they have the same number of species, there's a sense of greater overall variety.
Yeah, exactly. That's what species evenness is all about. It's not just how many species are present, but how their populations are distributed within that ecosystem. A more even distribution contributes to like a richer overall, tapestry of life.
So we have species richness and species evenness.
Yeah.
What other dimensions are we talking about here?
Well, another key one is what we call phenotypic variation.
Okay.
And this refers to the differences in the actual traits of the species. It's about how distinct they are from each other in terms of their physical characteristics, their behaviors, everything in between.
So, like, it's not just about having a lot of different species, but having species that are noticeably different from each other in terms of their traits. Like, a forest full of birds that all look and behave the same wouldn't be as diverse as a forest with a variety of bird species with, different colors and beaks and songs and all that.
Exactly, exactly. And to take that a step further, imagine like mapping all these traits in like a multidimensional space, what we call morphospace.
Right.
It's a way to visualize how much phenotypic space all those species occupy, and it can give us insights into how those traits have evolved over time.
So it's like a visual representation of how much variation exists across all those different species traits. And that's just another layer of this multidimensional view.
Right. But of course, we can't forget about how those species actually like interact with each other in their environment, right?
Right.
McLaurin and Sterolny also emphasize ecological interactions as this crucial dimension of biodiversity.
That makes sense. I mean, the way species relate to each other, through food webs or competition, symbiotic relationships, that's a huge part of what shapes the ecosystem.
Exactly. And this dimension raises all these really fascinating questions too, like, does a more diverse community in terms of its ecological interactions lead to greater stability or resilience? This is that classic diversity stability debate that ecologists have been, going back and forth about for decades.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how that interconnectedness between all those species contributes to the overall health and functioning of the entire ecosystem. Are there even more dimensions to this multidimensional view?
There's one more, and it's called phylogenetic diversity.
Okay.
And this one takes into account the evolutionary history of the species in that community.
Phylogenetic diversity. Remind me what that means again.
Well, think back to those evolutionary trees. We've all seen them, right?
Sure.
The ones that show how different species are related to each other over millions of years.
Yeah.
Phylogenetic diversity considers how much of that evolutionary history is represented in a given ecosystem. It's not just about the raw number of species, but the depth and breadth of their shared ancestry.
So like a forest with species from a variety of different branches on that evolutionary tree would be considered more phylogenetically diverse than a forest with species that are all pretty closely related.
Exactly. It's like looking at the family album of an ecosystem,
Yeah.
Appreciating the full range of evolutionary lineages that led to the species that we see there today.
This multidimensional view is really making me think about biodiversity in a whole new way. It's fascinating how all these different layers of variation fit together.
Yeah.
But it also seems incredibly complex to actually measure and keep track of all these dimensions in the real world.
Yeah, you're right. That's one of the, main critiques of this framework. It's a powerful way of thinking about it, but it's not always easy to put into practice. And that actually leads us to another approach, one that takes a more, how do you say it, a more pragmatic view of how we define and measure biodiversity.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about this alternative.
This alternative approach, it's championed by Sahotra Sarkar. He calls it the operational definition of biodiversity.
An operational definition. Okay, that sounds interesting. What's the idea behind that?
Well, instead of trying to pin down some kind of abstract, ideal definition of biodiversity, Sarkar says we should focus on how we actually do conservation.
Okay.
In other words, biodiversity becomes whatever we choose to protect.
So rather than defining it beforehand, we kind of figure out what it is by looking at what we're already, working to save.
Yeah.
Doesn't that seem kind of backwards?
Yeah, I can see why you'd say that. It might sound a little circular at first. But Sarkar's really emphasizing the practical side of conservation here, right? We have finite resources, and we often have to make these, really tough choices. Think about it. If our goal is to protect, say, 10% of each habitat type, how do we choose which specific areas to actually prioritize?
Right. It's like that ecological Tetris game we were talking about earlier.
Uh-huh.
We're trying to fit in the most valuable pieces, but we have to be strategic about it.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of place prioritization comes in.
Okay.
There are these powerful algorithms that analyze all sorts of data, species distribution, habitat quality, even things like, economic factors, human impact,
Wow.
to help us determine like which areas will provide the most biodiversity benefit for our limited conservation resources.
So we're using computer models now to help make these decisions. It seems like this approach brings together both the science and the practicalities of conservation.
It does. And what Sarkar argues is that the outcome of these prioritization efforts, the places that we ultimately choose to conserve, they effectively define biodiversity in this operational sense.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. It's like we're defining it through our actions.
Mm.
But doesn't this raise questions about whether we're just, I don't know, reinforcing existing biases? Like, what if the algorithms are prioritizing areas that are already well studied or easily accessible and maybe overlooking other important areas?
Yeah, that's a valid concern for sure.
Hmm.
There's a risk of kind of perpetuating those biases if we're not careful about how we, design and apply these algorithms. And Sarkar acknowledges that. But his point is that conservation is like inherently a practical endeavor, right?
Right.
We have to make choices, and those choices are inevitably going to shape our understanding of what is worth protecting.
So we're constantly refining our definition based on what we learn and the actions we take.
I see. So we've gone from this multidimensional view that kind of encompasses a lot of different factors to a more operational definition that focuses on the practicalities of conservation. Are there any other major approaches to defining biodiversity?
There's one more I want to bring in, and it's probably the most provocative of them all. Philosopher Carlos Santana, he argues that we should just get rid of the concept of biodiversity altogether.
Whoa, okay, now that's radical. Eliminate the whole idea. Why would he suggest that? He contends that biodiversity, it's more trouble than it's worth because it's such a broad term. Like, it masks all these very different values that we associate with nature, right? And those values, he says, can actually be in conflict with each other.
Okay, that's interesting. Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Imagine you have to choose between protecting like a small forest that's home to a critically endangered bird species, right?
Okay.
Or a much larger wetland that's, full of a common but ecologically important minnow.
Okay.
Both contribute to overall biodiversity, but our intuition might tell us to save the rare bird, right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I can see how just focusing on like this general idea of biodiversity doesn't really help us make those kinds of difficult decisions.
Right, and Santana argues that trying to like lump everything together under this one term can actually hinder conservation efforts. He says we need to be more upfront about our values and use political and economic tools to make like clear decisions about what we prioritize.
So instead of kind of hiding behind this idea of biodiversity, we need to have like honest conversations about what matters most to us and what we're willing to fight for.
It sounds like Santana's advocating for a more nuanced and transparent approach to conservation.
He is. Now, whether or not we actually abandon the term biodiversity, I mean, that's debatable. But Santana's critique, it raises these important questions about the values that underpin our conservation choices.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from that multidimensional view to an operational definition and even a call to, abandon the concept altogether. It's clear that biodiversity is way more complex than it seems at first glance.
I agree. It's been a fascinating exploration, and I think the key takeaway for our listeners is this. While, biodiversity can be this useful shorthand, it's important to think critically about what it actually means
Right.
and the values that it reflects. There's no single easy answer here. And we have to grapple with these different ways that we can define and measure this incredible variety of life on Earth. That's a great point to end on. As you continue to explore the world of conservation, remember to pay attention to the choices that are being made, what's being prioritized, and what's being left out. Whose values are shaping those decisions?
Those are crucial questions to consider. Well, thank you for having me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this philosophical journey into the heart of biodiversity. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.